G'day mate, 40 here. So news that we've been hearing for weeks on Mark Halperin's show that many Republican political operatives are confident that Donald Trump is going to win. Right? We've been hearing that for over a month on Mark Halperin's show, and now you're seeing it in the mainstream media, where the New Yorker has an essay today by Susan Glasser, its chief political consultant. Essentially, should we be panicking? Meaning should liberals be panicking? Well, Mark Halperin made the argument based on private polling that liberals should be panicking over a month ago. Number one, Kamala Harris just shows no ability to drive a message and to speak extemporaneously. And that Kamala Harris's new media strategy is to engage in a ton of interviews and town halls. Given how mediocre to bad she is at this, bespeaks desperation on their part. And you wouldn't have known this if you'd just been following conventional news media coverage. So Nate Silver and many of the pollsters and analysts, reporters in the mainstream media are taking all sorts of shots at Mark Halperin. And Halperin's analysis for weeks now has been informed by the private polling, which is much higher quality polling that is being conducted by both Republicans and Democrats. All right, it's not just that Republicans have private polls showing that Donald Trump is going to comfortably claim victory in a month, but Democratic private polls show the same thing, that the Rust Belt states seem solidly in Donald Trump's direction and seem to be moving that way more each day, with Republican voter registration consistently outpacing Democratic voter registration in Rust Belt states. Now we're seeing this feedback into Axios, New York Times, New Yorker, the elite mainstream media coverage. And the daunting issue for Democrats and for Kamala Harris is that insecurity is not easily overcome. So, for example, I had a voice problem, right? I had Kermit the Frog voice. I was stuck in a monotone voice. And in one voice lesson from a great teacher, Amy Chapman, I was able to overcome that. All right, I saw what I needed to overcome this problem where my voice was just stuck in the bottom of my larynx. And it was hard for me to move out of monotone, and it was hard for me to project my voice. One lesson for that. But it's really hard to fix insecurity, and it's particularly hard to do if the person has a drinking or benzodiazepine problem, which Kamala Harris seems to have. Right? There's all sorts of video evidence that she has a drinking or benzo problem, and it fits, right? If you reason from the likeliest explanation, you'd note that Kamala Harris's deep-seated insecurity is also manifesting in a drinking and benzo problem. And it's a likely explanation for the incoherent, sloshed, and drunk way that she often appears in public. And you would expect someone with her level of insecurity to turn to something like liquid courage. But I'll be honest, I would love to have some benzos on hand just for the sake of dealing with, or just having the security that it's there when the stress of life and defeats of life and the humiliations dished out by life become overwhelming. It would be a great relief to me to know that in my cupboard I had a benzo that I could turn to. And it explains so much of Kamala Harris's public persona. It's just she just comes across as drunk. Now, Hugh Hewitt has been doing some shows saying Kamala Harris doesn't know how to diagnose a sentence. So here's two classic ways that two different analysts confront things. So Hugh Hewitt is looking at the problem on a literal level, that Kamala Harris does not tend to speak in declarative sentences. Her sentences just wander on and on with one dependent clause after another dependent clause. And he sees this as a lack of learning to diagram sentences. Well, I learned to diagram sentences, but I was never very good at it. I'm not sure how much I learned at it. I was probably a C student at diagramming sentences. But I think Hugh Hewitt, along with a lot of other pundits, they confuse the symptom with the cause. Right? Her word salads, her inability to speak in definitive sentences is a result of her crushing insecurity, and learning to diagnose sentences is not going to overcome that. And this idea that there's just this easy fix, all right, for Kamala Harris's public presentation problem, she has a great team behind her, and they've done an amazing job with such a mediocre product. And if there was a quick fix, if teaching Kamala to diagram sentences would get her out of trouble, they would do it. But one of the downsides of affirmative action, and Kamala Harris has consistently benefited from affirmative action. Remember, Joe Biden promised that he would select essentially a black woman as his vice presidential candidate. And so if Joe Biden had not limited his search just to black women, Kamala Harris would never have been the vice president of the United States. Right? She was not in the top 50 most skilled politicians, most effective politicians, most capable people to put in that role. Right? She would not have belonged in a list of your top 50. She has benefited from affirmative action and from her affair with a married man, Willie Brown. And he opened up politics to her. He explained politics to her. The best thing you can say about Kamala's political knowledge is that she learned from Willie Brown, who was a very effective politician. Right? He taught her politics through the tip of his penis, and he gave her his political machine, and that's what enabled her burst into politics. And she's only ever had to run in California and get elected in California, where she's good at the insider game. So she depended on affirmative action to get into law school. She's depended on affirmative action to become vice president of the United States. And the downside of that is that it leaves you with deep insecurity because you know you didn't get the job on merit. All right, let's go to the chat. Damn, a lot of messages getting held for review. I can smell the LA morning foliage. I love the smell of LA. Kamala will make this country prosper. Why has she been holding back the prosperity? Where am I from? I'm from Australia, mate. Hello from Poland. Don't do drugs, kids. Do I usually talk about politics? Probably 50% of the time, but particularly with this presidential election where we're less than a month away, Kamala brings joy and not fear. What a lousy platform, right? Most Americans are not in a state of joy, and joy is a wonderful thing in and of itself, but it's inappropriate response to desperate circumstances. Would you go to the victims of Hurricane Milton and say, I bring a message of joy and good vibes? Kamala seems to be quasi-rapping. Do I like fish sticks? No, I don't. I have never done drugs. I've never even tried marijuana. I don't drink. I've never tried any harder drugs. Luke was early to recognizing Kamala's drinking problem. Yeah, and her drinking problem has been talked about going back to about 2015, just as Joe Biden was showing obvious signs of senility in 2018. So there's a great reason to watch Mark Halperin's show. He's now doing it twice a day, 9 a.m. Eastern and 6 p.m. Eastern, and you'll consistently feel ahead of the curve. And it's not that he's Nostradamus, right? It's not that Mark Halperin, former political director at ABC News, is always right in his predictions, but he has a wide variety of sources in both the Democratic and Republican Party, and he does an excellent job of being fair. And you can't watch his shows and think that he's rooting for Kamala Harris or for Trump or for the Republicans or for the Democrats, because he gets his prestige from striving to be a fair-minded, nonpartisan observer. And so why would someone give up the source of their prestige? He's not going to throw away his standing. He is deeply connected to both political parties. He has a very wide social and professional circle. He's not going to give up his credibility. He's not going to give up his standing. He's not going to give up his status, right, pursuing some partisan agenda. He's excellent at calling out, for example, mainstream media bias against Republicans, particularly the horrible job done by Margaret Brennan of CBS News during the vice presidential debate, and the horrible job done by David Muir and Lindsay, the ABC News moderators, during the Trump-Harris debates. And so you'd think that Kamala Harris would learn from all these interviews she's giving, right? You'd think she'd learn to put together declarative sentences. I mean, think about how superb J.D. Vance was in his debate, right? That had to take almost everyone by surprise. He was prepared, right? He came with an agenda to dispel this notion that he was a Nazi guy. He presented himself in a way most likely to appeal to women voters and to moderates. He was highly effective, and he has been handling hostile news media ever since he was selected as Donald Trump's running mate, and he's done an excellent job. He's done an unbelievably good job. He is far more articulate than Donald Trump. Now, Trump has a charisma and a sense of humor that J.D. Vance does not. And so when Trump's admirers, right, try to emulate his sense of humor, it rarely works, right? It just comes off as cringe. Donald Trump is the funniest public personality in America. Right? Tell me who is a funnier politician than Donald Trump. And what's particularly funny is when he shows flashes of self-awareness, such as when he marvels at the breadth of his support from evangelical Christians in particular. Now, we're 4 days past October 7, and I am surprised by the mildness of the anti-Israel, pro-Palestine rallies held on October 7. So why the heck is that true? Right, one answer is that the anti-Israel protests were largely synthetic, that they were organized perhaps by a hostile outside power such as Iran, organized, funded by Iran, and Iran sees that it's not in its interest to have Kamala Harris elected. So we had so much talk about Russian interference with the American political campaign of 2016 and 2020, but there doesn't seem to be nearly as much media discussion about Iran's interference in the 2020 campaign and the 2024 campaign. So Iran clearly does not want Donald Trump to become elected president. And so I suspect, to whatever extent that Iran funds and directs the anti-Israel protests on college campus, that Iran recognizes that these rallies are not in its best interests, because the more intense the anti-Israel protests, right, the more that Democrats tear themselves apart, the worse it looks for Joe Biden's foreign policy and for the Biden administration. Right, the more chaos there is, the worse it looks for the incumbent party, which is the Democrats. So if these anti-Israel protests have been primarily some top-down operation run by Iran, which there's not been much media coverage, then that could be an explanation. Another explanation is that the anti-Israel protests are top-down, run by Democratic activists, and they simply recognize it's not in the Democratic Party's best interest right now to have anti-Israel rallies that convulse the nation. Other explanations are that the anti-Israel protests were from the bottom up, and they were strengthened when Israel was struggling and when Israelis were being slaughtered by their enemies. And now that Israel's fighting back successfully, that's taken the enthusiasm and the strength and the heart out from anti-Israel protesters. Another explanation is that people often start the school year in a more serious frame of mind. They want to move ahead with their education, they want to graduate, they want to land prestigious jobs. They have various goals that they set for themselves, and they don't want to derail that by spending their time protesting and possibly getting arrested. And on the other hand, when we had these intense anti-Israel riots, right, they were last spring. So they were in April, right, and people will get restless, right, 8 months into a school year. If these anti-Israel protests were primarily from the bottom down, then people get restless in April, and people don't tend to arrive at university restless. Another reason for the milder protests is that universities recognize that to maintain their standing, right, we all need, not just universities, businesses, we all will find it much easier and congenial for our life and for our projects to have either the tacit approval or the absence of active opposition of the people around us. And if universities allow themselves to be taken over by an anti-Israel crowd, that will provoke intense blowback from many billionaires who support Israel, and also reduce public confidence in universities and reduce public willingness to fund universities. So I've been a blogger since 1997, and it's been my aim to not galvanize hatred towards me. I haven't carried through on this with 100% success, but I do think about what will people think of what I'm about to write, who don't have any particular agenda, who are not pro or con Luke Ford. How will that affect them? Because if I arouse a serious enough opposition to what I'm writing or what I'm commenting on in my YouTube videos, that just makes my life hell, and I don't want that. And so I want to make my points in words that will be as congenial as possible for as large an audience as possible, because we all depend on the consent of the community. Now, other people don't really care about us, but if we become sufficiently disruptive or sufficiently obnoxious, right, people will very quickly coalesce around this person's a problem, right, this person's a jerk, this person's a disruption. And universities want goodwill. Businesses want goodwill, and individuals should want goodwill as well, which is why institutions and individuals devote considerable resources to image management. And there was quickly a consensus among those running universities that you cannot allow these anti-Israel protests to disrupt campus business. And so that's the dividing line. Once these protesters start taking over public space and then limiting access to university facilities based on whether or not you're a Zionist. That is unacceptable, leaves you wide open for lawsuits, and you'll become the target of a high intense, well-funded pro-Israel crowd. Halperin had his own scandal. Yes, he did, right? But it doesn't mean he's less of a political commentator. I think there's a 30% chance for a Trump blowout. Looking at the chat, Halperin is being fair because he's rebuilding after Me Too. Yeah, that's true. When I've been humiliated, right, I put much more attention into being fair and careful and balanced. If Trump wins, will there be a new Russiagate-like conspiracy theory? I'm not sure. I think there'll be a mental health crisis on the left, but I don't think they will try to cope with one conspiracy theory like 2016. What do I think about Trump being a draft dodger? I don't really care. I understand why people would try to avoid service in the Vietnam War. Should we have a tax boycott in case of election fraud? No, because if you boycott paying your taxes, that's very likely to negatively rebound on you. How about the thousands of bombs raining down on innocent civilians in Afghanistan, and the big boy he dropped there short of a nuke? Well, Afghanistan was taken over by the Taliban, and even if Taliban doesn't reflect the approval of most of the population, they were the single most effective force in the country. And so when you have a highly dedicated, highly intense, committed minority such as the Taliban, they can take over a country, and then the whole country is going to pay the price for its ruling regime. Am I looking for packages to steal? God forbid. Should we be worried about the military-industrial complex? I think accurate criticism of power and of ourselves works to everyone's advantage. 19 million US government employees looking for a job. I doubt that. I doubt that even 1% of them will be looking for a job when Trump takes over. Most Europeans and Americans don't live in the real world. It's this fantasy world where people act like feelings are important. Just because you feel like eating doesn't mean you're not going to starve. Well, feelings are important, right? Feelings are a source of wisdom and truth and guidance. They're not absolute. Right? But feelings will often give you a more accurate read of reality than your thinking. Not really. It's important to be able to take feedback and brush off haters. Well, you want to be able to listen for accurate criticism. And so if you tell me, Luke, you were ignorant, when was the last time you read a book? That would not bother me because I read a lot of books. And so I just know it's nonsense. On the other hand, if you say, Luke, you're so predictable, you just got these certain set of principles, and then you look at the news and you just recite those parts of the news that validate your principles. It's such a lazy way of analyzing the world. Then I think about that and go, yeah, that's pretty accurate. Yeah, if you're so proud to be Palestinian, then go be a Palestinian in Palestine. That's why there was a hilarious billboard by a pro-Israel group offering $1 million to Queers for Gaza to go conduct a Queers for Gaza protest in Gaza. So Leslie Stahl asked Secretary of State Madeleine Albright if the hundreds, I think even hundreds of thousands of dead children in Iraq were worth U.S. sanctions, and Albright said yes, and then she immediately regretted what she said. So there have been studies indicating that up to 2 million Iraqi children died because of U.S. sanctions, and there are other studies that disputed that number. I am for fewer U.S. sanctions in general. And certainly the sanctions that caused the starvation of thousands of Iraqi children indisputably, I think that was a disaster. Don't use our freedoms of speech for your hate. Well, if you love something, you're going to hate that which threatens it. So hate is usually a lazy word to decry people who are effectively fighting for what they love. So I noticed that hate is used as a term of opprobrium mainly on the political left, instead of engaging with people's arguments. Palestinians aren't allowed to go to Palestine. They don't have a right of return, which is protected under international law. Well, there's never a Palestinian state, so you don't have any right to return to something that was never a state. Right? Palestinians aren't members of a nation state, ergo they don't enjoy the rights of citizens of a nation state. Yes, more effective, more efficient, more powerful groups will usually outcompete less intelligent, less effective groups. And so Zionists organize more quickly and more effectively than the pro-Palestine crowd. As a result, we have a Zionist state on the land of Palestine, and we don't have a Palestinian state. People saying, send the Palestinians back to Palestine. All wars are banker wars, supplying and funding both sides. Luke, will you conduct a stream from an electronic scooter? No. So I think it's silly when people ride scooters without a helmet. That just strikes me as incredibly reckless. So 50% of the podcasts that I'm listening to these days are on the Israel-Iran war. And we're just waiting for the shoe to drop for Israel to retaliate for Iran's 190 missiles that it hit Israel with on October 1st. And I expect that the Israeli retaliation will be devastating. But I'd be surprised if they go after Iran's oil processing facilities and nuclear facilities. I would expect much more focus on Iran's ballistic missile program and its airfields. I also would expect leading members of the Iranian regime to be assassinated. Also, one smart thing that the cops did at UCLA on October 7th when there was an anti-Israel protest 4 days ago, that even though the protesters were operating in a zone that was not approved for protesting, right, the cops didn't automatically go in and arrest them because the protesters weren't disrupting the normal functioning of the university. So laws on the books are one thing, but they always have to be interpreted and enforced by human beings who usually have varying amounts of discretion. So using your discretion not to go in and arrest protesters who aren't harming anyone seemed like a wise choice. You're creating incentives when you target your arrests at people who are disrupting the normal function of a university or of a business, right? You create incentives for people to take stock of their actions and how they affect other people. And so too, when Israel takes out the leaders of Hezbollah, notice that nobody wants to stand up and lead Hezbollah anymore. Right? There are no seeming volunteers to be the next leader of Hezbollah, because the evidence suggests that Israel would just assassinate you. It's like the plot of The Sopranos, where Tony Soprano doesn't want to be number one because he knows that if he's on the face of it, the number one leader of his mafia gang in New Jersey, that he'll be targeted by the feds and taken down. So who needs that kind of trouble? And so Israel is steadily taking out the Hezbollah leadership, and that significantly reduces the incentive to join Hezbollah. And if leaders in the anti-Israel protest movement are blacklisted for jobs, right, that will significantly reduce the incentive for people to publicly protest against Israel. And given how thoroughly Israel has infiltrated Iranian communications, you would expect that leaders of Iran, particularly leaders of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, to start getting assassinated. So this is by far the longest war that Israel's ever fought, and it's nowhere near over. But given the successful trajectory that Israel's on, I would expect they're going to keep pushing. It's interesting that Hezbollah wants a ceasefire in Lebanon, but Israel has no interest in granting a ceasefire because they've got Hezbollah on the run. They are pounding them back into the Stone Age. One Israeli analyst put it this way: the munitions and arsenal that Hezbollah accumulated over 20 years, Israel has destroyed in 2 weeks. And that's the sort of devastation that a higher IQ military can wreak on a lower IQ militant group. And we're seeing that dramatic IQ difference in the asymmetrical battle between Israel and Hezbollah, where Israel is wiping out more than 10 Hezbollah soldiers for every one that it loses of its own. And we also saw that in Gaza, right? Israel has not even suffered 1,000 IDF deaths yet, but they've apparently killed over 10,000 members of Hamas and killed and wounded thousands of members of Hezbollah. So they are fighting an asymmetrical war on their own terms. They've got what seems to be a winning and effective strategy. And this fight against Iran is not going to be over in a week. Right? It's likely to last for weeks, for months. And if Donald Trump is elected president, he's very likely to give Israel a free hand unless, essentially, Iran capitulates. Unless we get some kind of regime change. Because if you eventually take out enough leaders of the Iranian regime, right? The average IQ in Iran is about 82, right? It's a lower average IQ than among African Americans or Mexican Americans. And so there's not a huge number of geniuses in Iran. And if you start assassinating the geniuses that run Iran, and they do have very smart people running the regime, right? There aren't an infinite pool of high IQ replacements. And if Israel is effective at assassinating the leaders of the Iranian Muslim regime, as effective as they were against Hezbollah, then there's going to be a great deal of reluctance on the part of Iranians to step up and take leadership positions that are going to make them highly likely to be assassinated by Israel. So Israel is creating all sorts of incentives for the Iranian terror-supported network to rethink things and to step away from armed confrontation. Because when you're losing day in and day out and your leaders are getting assassinated, it's terrible for morale, it's terrible for communications. It's very difficult to plan effective retaliation. And if all the leaders of the Iran Revolutionary Guard were taken out, that would dramatically handicap Iran's ability to respond to Israel, just as Hezbollah keeps lobbing rockets over at Israel, but they're not doing much damage. Hezbollah is not able to marshal a coherent and effective response to Israel's attacks. And if Israel wipes out the leaders of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, right, Iran will be much less likely to be able to mount effective responses to Israel's attacks. Zionists talk extensively about creating their theocracy ethno-state in Palestine. All maps of thousands of years prior to 1948 say Palestine. Yeah, they can say Palestine, but there's never an independent Palestinian state. Where am I from? I'm from near Sydney, Australia. Grew up in Australia for my first 11 years. Who supplies the enemy then? International bankers? Well, Hezbollah gets most of its funding from international drug deals. War makes lots of money, peace doesn't. Well, war makes money for some people and costs money to others. Peace allows for some people to make money. Did you know the pyramid on the US $1 bill exists in real life? You have to travel to the Middle East to see it. to a place called Israel Supreme Court Building, brought by the Rothschilds. This neighborhood looks nice. Yes, this is Westwood, near UCLA, the University of California at Los Angeles, 5 miles from the beach. Does one need a smelly Santa gray beard to run Hezbollah? No, but it helps. Stop suggesting or acting like Arabs or Muslims are stupid or unorganized. It is inaccurate. Clearly not listening to both sides. Instead, too much propaganda. Okay, so talk to me about prosperous, free Arab states. Which of the Arab Sunni states do you think are particularly well run? Where would you like to live in the Arab world? It's not an IQ difference. It's an obvious IQ difference. It's so dramatic. You see it in almost all the Arab-Israeli wars. Iran will send 50,000 missiles each day. Well, given that Iran only has at a maximum 3,000 ballistic missiles, it's simply incapable of sending 50,000 missiles each day. Where are you walking, bro? Westwood, California. I'm 5 miles from the Santa Monica beach. The Iron Dome does not have an infinite amount of rockets. Yes, but that's a great question. We don't know how well supplied Israel is. And when you look at the video of the Iranian ballistic missile attack on October 1st, it sure looked to me, my own lying eyes told me that 90% of the missiles got through. And so my own lying eyes told me that the Israeli missile defense system was not terribly effective. But whatever happens in the Middle East, whether Israel wins, Hezbollah wins, Hamas wins, it's not going to affect the life of Americans, right? American prosperity is not dependent on any particular configuration of the Middle East. So whatever happens in the Ukraine war has nothing to do with American interests. Whatever happens in the Israel, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas war has nothing to do with American interests. So I think there's a very good case for America removing a lot of its unnecessary involvement in military forces in the Middle East. Israel has always been defending itself, right, because it's set up the Jewish state in a very tough, rough neighborhood with a great deal of opposition to the Jewish state in its midst. And think about how embarrassing it must be to live in that neighborhood and see this newcomer, the Jewish state, vastly excel you. So the Arab Islamic world used to be highly civilized group, but for the last 600, 700 years, it's been incredibly backward. And so now you have this thriving, prosperous Jewish state in its midst, which just sheds an uncomfortable and embarrassing comparison with the low level of the Arab Islamic world right now. I don't think there's a permanent condition of the Arab Islamic world, but for the last 600 or 700 years, it's been incredibly backward. Iran has a variety of ballistic missiles. Yes, it does, and it's got a maximum number of 3,000. You don't send billions to another country and not have an interest of some kind. Yeah, there's an interest in getting elected, right? Support for Israel is particularly intense among people who are willing to go to great lengths to support Israel. So there is a very effective Israel lobby, and it's very difficult to run for public office in the United States without the blessing of the Israel lobby. And this is the opposite of some dark conspiracy, right? This is all out in the open, right? We know how lobbies work. There are very effective lobbies, such as the senior citizen lobby and the pharmaceutical lobby and parts of the military-industrial complex lobby, and there's a very effective pro-Israel lobby. All right, what's going on in the Middle East is absolutely going to affect the lives of Americans. How? Americans are paying for it, arming it, and driving the country down into the ground for Israel. So I believe America gives about $4 billion a year to Israel. So that's less than 0.1% of the federal budget. It just makes no difference to the lives of Americans, which side wins in the Middle East or in the Ukraine war. So I would expect that Americans would primarily be interested in American interests. Right? Why would most Americans be terribly interested in something that does not affect them? Yeah, Iran does not have the capability of exploding a nuclear weapon in Westwood. Your tax dollars go there, yeah, but less than 0.1% of the federal budget goes to Israel. Yeah, the only independent state in the land that currently bears the name Israel have been Jewish states in the past 3,000 years. America isn't run by Americans, then who's America run by? Like, people just love to blame their problems on some other group. But American problems are primarily caused by Americans. Jewish problems are primarily caused by Jews. Black problems are primarily caused by blacks. Mexican problems are primarily caused by fellow Mexicans. Now, everyone can construct a victim narrative, and the stronger your in-group identity, right, the more likely you are to believe in your victim narrative. Right? You can't have a strong Jewish identity without simultaneously having a strong victimhood identity. You can't have a strong American identity without having a sense of American victimhood. You can't have a strong Muslim identity without having a strong sense of Islamic victimhood. That's just the nature of in-group identity. And every group has abundant reasons for why they should feel oppressed. So my preferred type of podcast is by academics, right? I like listening to what people have spent their entire career studying. That's my preference. I prefer the perspectives of those who have had 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years studying a particular area to those of pundits who just surf the discourse and like me. So in the academic dialogues that I'm hearing about war in the Middle East, there's a certain type of piety that creates these stilted conversations about how war is bad and war is not the answer, and the only answer is compromise and diplomacy, and usually this should be led by America. Right? That's what I hear again and again and again when I listen to the academic discourse on the current Middle East conflicts. It reminds me of a segment of the biblical book of Isaiah where the prophet complains they cry peace, peace when there is no peace. So in some situations, war is better than peace. In some situations, it is preferable to kill your enemy rather than to negotiate with him. In other situations, it's better to reach an accommodation, reach a deal, use diplomacy. It's not like there's one answer for all situations, for all dilemmas. So it may well be that this current war is in Israel's best interests. Right? The indications of the past 3 weeks are that Israel's winning. And is it possible that Lebanon will be able to regain sovereignty over its own land and stop the Hezbollah threat? Because as long as Hezbollah is a threat to Israel, Israel's incentivized to bomb the hell out of it. And any community or individual who gives any succor to Hezbollah and to those who support Hezbollah, right, he puts himself at death's door. The Iranian Islamic regime is hated by 80% of Iranians. So if its oil exporting business was destroyed, right, that regime would likely topple. It would lose about 90% of the money that it earns from exports. And it's hard to imagine a new set of rulers for Iran who are worse than the current set. So it appears to me right now that Israel is dug in for a long war, that it will increasingly induct members of the Haredi, the traditional Orthodox community, into the armed forces, because Israel needs soldiers. Right now it appears Israel is going to get pretty much all the weapons that it needs from the United States to wage its wars. And Israel is striking at threats to the West much more effectively than the United States has done. Right? Israel has struck the Houthis much more devastating blows than the American-led alliance parked off the shore of Yemen. Just because there's an effective pro-Israel lobby doesn't mean that America is not still run by Americans. Right? When there is a pro-senior citizen lobby, right, it's still run by Americans. We lost our sovereignty since the creation of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Well, where do you think they have it better, right? Against an idyllic vision of utopia, you can find all sorts of problems with the United States. But what are real-world countries who you think are on a better trajectory, where life is just so much better, where they have much stronger freedoms? Right? The United States is outpacing its competitors. Its economy is growing faster. Its innovation leads the world. Its military is the strongest. Iran is very near nuclear, so there are different opinions on that. You have a lot of expert opinions saying it'll take Iran at least a year to be able to assemble a nuclear warhead, and then others who say it can do it in much less time. In the words of Woodrow Wilson, "I am a most unhappy man. I've unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by a system of credit." I didn't know if Woodrow Wilson said that. But name me some countries that you'd like to live where they don't have the equivalent of a Federal Reserve. Would you really like to live in North Korea? The growth of the nation and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. Well, every society is ruled by its elites. You'll never have a society that is not dominated by a small number of elites. Yeah, Iran could be nuclear in a month, may not become nuclear in a month because it likely doesn't want to be destroyed in a month. So people did not grow up out of the land, right? Everybody moved from somewhere and conquered and held the territory that their people now occupy. So it's not like settler colonialism is something unique to those of European heritage. All right, you can't name any country that's on a better trajectory than the United States. If only we had an honest money supply backed by gold and silver. Look, I get it. You want a magic key for how the world works, and you imagine that if our money supply was backed by gold and silver, that would create a dramatic difference in our economic prosperity. But we have the most prosperous major nation in the world, and we are outstripping the economic growth of Europe, of Japan, of China, and of Russia. Right? The Chinese economy is in great peril. Japan's economy has been stagnant for 30 years. Russia's economy is stagnant. And the United States economy is growing much faster than Europe. If you think China and Russia are better off than the United States, then I don't believe you're living in reality. Like which public scholars would make that same argument? We have a $216 trillion deficit. Okay, so who do you think has it better, right? China has a much bigger debt problem than the United States. The problem isn't the size of the debt. The problem is the size of the economy relative to the debt. So right now, there's absolutely no reason to believe that the United States has a significant debt problem. You can toss out scary numbers, but given the dramatic growth of the US economy and the power of the US economy, there's no reason to believe that it cannot handle its current debt levels. So as each year goes by, the relative distance between the American economy and the economies of its chief competitors, that relative distance grows. Right? America is much stronger in its economy now than it was 5 years ago, vis-a-vis Europe, vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis Japan, China, with all our rivals. Right? America in 10 years will be even stronger vis-a-vis its rivals than it is today. America is on a terrific trajectory in terms of economic and military growth. Doesn't mean it doesn't have problems, but China and Russia are just fighting for survival. Japan has a problem with China right next door. Right? The United States is far better situated than any other major country. So you're making a lot of big statements, Frosty, about how the US is worse off than China and Russia, but you can't cite any studies, you can't cite any academic books. Right? There are no scholars of economics and geopolitics who would agree with you. So perhaps the biggest question that I'm dreaming about right now is, can Israel remake the Middle East? Right? This goal of remaking the Middle East has resulted in tears and suffering so many times over the past decades. Now, once again, there is hope that Lebanon can be restored to sovereignty over Hezbollah, that the Iranian mullahs can be crushed, that Hezbollah and Hamas can be crushed. At the same time, the polite discourse, the academic discourse, is that Israel's paying a huge price in international opprobrium for its military successes. And this is because of Israel's putative violation of human rights of terrorists and terrorist supporters. So I suspect that when push comes to shove, despite what Sunni Arab states say publicly, what primarily will determine whether or not the state of Israel gets support from other nations is how capable Israel is, not whether or not it's cruel, because plenty of other nations engage in human rights abuse. And that doesn't attract nearly the same attention at the United Nations. So my thesis is that nations are primarily self-interested, that if Israel demonstrates it is the strong horse in the Middle East, it humiliates and subjugates its enemies, then it will attract considerable support because people like to side with winners. People don't want to side with losers. You can invent all sorts of reasons for why you're mad at someone. But when you finally see the big dog, when you finally see who holds the cards, who wields the power, who's winning, and Israel's on a trajectory that is going to have much stronger economic growth than Turkey and Iran. Israel's currently on a winning trajectory. Most other nations eventually are going to want to side with winners, not with losers. Hey, if America can pay off its debt, why haven't they? Why would they want to? I'll talk to you blokes later.